would like to ask you in the round, as we already did in the first webinar, which stakeholder groups are taking part today in the session. So please indicate your stakeholder group by clicking in the survey tool that is shown now. So not everyone has clicked so far, but I can already see that there are different stakeholders presented, which is good, and also that there are some tourism businesses represented. So, thank you for sharing. And so I would like to shortly introduce the whole project once more, and then I hand over to Matthias from Focusright to explain in more detail what we did in Thailand and Myanmar and how it is connected to the overall project. So the basis of the current project on human rights impact assessments is our online Get Started tool, which is available on the website since March 2019, and which offers a first step to get an understanding of human rights risks along the value chain. And following the UN guiding principles, the assessment of potential and actual human rights risks and impacts is crucial for a human rights due diligence process. So the current project has two parts that are complementing each other. There's the first part, the development of practical guidance, which is the online tool, which is funded by the German Development Corporation GIZ. And this blueprint tool is, should facilitate access to sector-specific information on human rights issues for tour operators in selected destinations. It should provide support for the identification and prioritization of impact areas with the tourism value chain, and it should guide tour operators in taking concrete measures to address issues identified and implement due diligence strategies in a targeted and pragmatic manner. So the target group for this online tool, the practical guidance, are SME tour operators and tourism companies who already started to develop comprehensive human rights due diligence strategies and worked, for example, with the Get Started tool to identify human rights related impact of their business. It is not a tool for CSR expert, but rather for responsible businesses. So it has a very strong business focus or perspective. And the second part, the value chain assessment, which is funded by the Swiss Federal Department for Foreign Affairs, FDFA, was now conducted in Myanmar and Thailand from the 4th of 7 to 17th September. And I will shortly hand over to Matthias to explain this part in more detail. So with our webinars today and the last webinars also, we would like to inform about the on-site assessment that we conducted in Thailand and Myanmar, and to guide you step by step through the content of the blueprint tool. So I would like to hand over now to Matthias from Focusright, who will explain in detail the tool and what it looked like to test it on the ground and what we will do with it, with the findings and learnings now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Yara, for the introduction. So what we will present now is basically the work we did in Thailand and Myanmar. But just a very brief recap. What we did actually. Previous webinar, a lot of you already joined the previous webinar, but still I think it's important that you get kind of the overall picture. So basically the blueprint that has been mentioned by Yara, which is the online tool for tour operators to analyze impacts and risks of the value chain during an impact assessment, is divided into 5 phases. So we are having a business scoping, a human rights scoping, the actual assessment, and then certainly the whole follow-up definition of action plan and measures at the destination. So what we will do now today is mainly focusing on the online assessment, but still I think it is very important to highlight very briefly what we did in the first phase. So in the business scoping, we have basically agreed with our private sector partners to do and conduct an impact assessment in Thailand and in Myanmar. And the focus was very strongly on the value chain of a tour operator. So we did not conduct actually country-specific, sector-wide tourism impact assessment in 2 destinations, but we very strongly focused on the actual tourism value chain to narrow down the scope in a first step. In the whole scoping phase, the business scoping, we reached out to a vast number of business stakeholders, including the destination management organization, which were certainly key partners for us. And I think it's also time now also to thank them to be part of the project, because I think they shared a lot of valuable insights and contacts with us. So thanks to all also the DMCs and private sector partners who made this happening on the ground, because it was really extremely valuable to have the business contacts and network of the people on the ground. Then we mapped basically out the whole kind of stakeholder landscape in the 2 destinations to get a good overview of the business sector partners. But this whole business scoping is part, as I said, of the first webinar, which is also available online on the Roundtable website. Then after conducting this business scoping, we followed basically the methodology that is also described in the blueprint for the human rights scoping. So prior to conducting the impact assessment, we basically did a lot of desktop research. We reached out to a huge number of stakeholders to get some sort of a first picture in the 2 destinations. So by reading reports from civil society organizations, from international organizations, reaching out to a huge number of stakeholders, again, international organizations, civil society, private sector, partly government associations, and so on. We got some sort of a first overall picture about potential issues in the two countries. So certainly the reading of the report helped us to find out who are the relevant stakeholders, what are the relevant topics. So we got already some sort of overview first on critical issues in the 2 destinations when it comes to human rights, and also a relatively long list of potential stakeholders we might be able to consult during actual on-site assessment. So that was basically the human rights scoping. Then the whole preparation. I think the challenge was certainly having this multi-stakeholder approach being mandated by the Roundtable. We also had to make sure that we somehow reflect the mandate of the Roundtable, reaching out to a diverse number of stakeholders. We had to narrow down actually quite a bit the scope and prioritize stakeholders to consult, and then also to develop a concrete assessment plan. So what we will explain during the webinar today is certainly somehow how an impact assessment is being conducted, but a few measures we implement and a few actions we did on the ground were also mainly due to the Roundtable multi-stakeholder setup. And some of the workshops and consultations might not necessarily be something that a smaller or a medium-sized tour operator will be able to do, but it's mainly due to the Roundtable setup. I think that's also important to highlight here. So when reaching out to stakeholders on the ground. I think it is important, and it's also demanded by actual international standards, that you consult actually all the potentially affected groups, which is not always easy. And I want to ask you the question, if you would reach out to a destination such as Thailand and Myanmar, in your opinion, which potentially affected groups might be the most difficult to access? And we also have prepared a short survey for this. So I think it's also good if you want to mention some reasons why you mentioned a certain group, use also the chat function. The chat function is also here to raise questions during the webinar, so please feel free to add comments and also questions in the chat function so that we can also take up some of your questions during the webinar. So, looking somehow at the result, we can see that, in your opinion, it's difficult to reach out to indigenous people, children, and partly also migrant workers. So you think it's easier to access actually business stakeholders, which I think we partly agree that through the network and the contacts we got through also the private sector members, it is probably easier to reach out to the business stakeholders rather to civil society organizations and indigenous people and, for example, also children. So I think what is important when you reach out to a country such as Myanmar and Thailand, and you would acknowledge that actually it's not always easy to get access to indigenous people, migrant workers, for example, and or children. So it is, as mentioned, it is important that you reach out to all affected groups, and especially the most vulnerable groups that are in this respective destination need to be consulted. And it's not always easy to get access. So what we did now in Thailand and in Myanmar, for example, we used legitimate representatives, which basically can speak on behalf of those affected groups. So just giving you one example, you mentioned the migrant workers. Whilst conducting interviews with hotel workers in Thailand, we got access actually to some of the migrant workers, but not in a rather systematic way. So what we managed to do is get contact of a civil society organization close to Kalak, which is mainly working with migrant workers coming from Myanmar over the border, working in the hotel sector, and has a vast knowledge about the issues and concerns related to migrant workers in the hotel sector in let's say, Kalak, Phuket, and probably also over Thailand. So by consulting this, let's say, legitimate representative organization, we got a very good picture on the situation of the migrant workers in Thailand, and also partly how the situation of the migrant workers in countries such as Myanmar, the sourcing countries, let's say, is. So we used actually this approach of legitimate representatives, using civil society organizations representing children and migrant workers during the assessment. Then, so I think that's when we talk about the prioritization of stakeholders, reaching out. A second important step preparing the assessment is actually setting up the assessment team. So as you know, we had Sibyl and Yara doing the work in Thailand, in Myanmar, and Tony from Their Touristic and myself mainly covering Thailand. So knowing the situation in the two countries, knowing that a lot of people only speak Thai and Myanmar, we also, felt the need to get local support in the two destinations. When compiling the assessment team, I think it is important that we considered certain issues such as people who understand the local context, the culture, the habits of the people, having certainly the language skills to translate certain interviews and focus group discussions. So it needs a mix of skills in the team. I mean, one thing is certainly the technical skills that are needed, but probably even more important are interpersonal and soft skills when you set up such an assessment team, so that you have people on the ground who know how to interact with people, who have social skills to talk to vulnerable groups. I think that was extremely important and helpful. So in Thailand, we worked with a foundation which is strongly focusing on women's rights, indigenous people rights, LGBT rights, which is called Manushya Foundation. We had a facilitator from the private sector. She used to work in the hotel sector, so she helped us a lot in terms of translation, also getting access to people in the private sector, in the hotel sector in Thailand. In the northern part of Thailand, we used the CBT network to work more closely with the communities and indigenous people in Thailand. In Myanmar, we worked with the different organizations. We had specific experts who were provided by different contacts. So it was extremely helpful and valuable to have these facilitators on the ground to manage actually the assessment on the ground using their local knowledge, the language skills, but also the intercultural and personal skills on the ground. So the assessment team is very important when we talk about preparation, but also to make the assessment as such a success. Then, as we know, we have always a limited time available. So we spend actually roughly 10 days in the two countries, in Thailand and in Myanmar. We tried as much as possible to have a schedule prepared before actually leaving Switzerland. So we arranged a lot of meetings, focus group discussions, so that the schedule was prepared. But as we all know, in those countries, you need to be flexible. People are not always responsive. If you write them an email in English, they might be hesitant to reply to you because they think they cannot write a proper email in English, so they rather don't reply to you. So communication is difficult, especially with people mainly fluent in Burmese and or in Thai. So the preparation is not always easy, but nevertheless, I think it is important to have a more or less kind of schedule in place before leaving for the on-site assessment. But at the same time, you need also certain flexibility. You need to be aware that people might only confirm meetings 1 day prior to the meeting. They might cancel short notice. And at the same time, I think it's also good to have a certain flexibility, to have some spontaneous meetings. So if you meet, for example, a souvenir seller, so that you can spend half an hour with the souvenir seller to have a chat with him, a more informal chat. So having this flexibility in order to react spontaneously also to changes, but also new interview opportunities, I think that's extremely important also when you prepare actually the on-site schedule. Then certainly before reaching out, you need to prepare a questionnaire. Also here, the blueprint of the roundtable, the online toolbox will provide you with very specific kind of questionnaires that should help actually the assessment team in future to address the right questions to the right stakeholders. So we prepared questionnaires for actually workers in hotels, for management in hotels, for NGOs, civil society organizations, international organizations. So we prepared specific questionnaires for different stakeholder groups, and actually the blueprint that we will develop will provide actually detailed questionnaires for further on-site assessments. Again, we clustered the interview guide around the human rights issues that we already have predefined in the Get Started tool. But again, here, the blueprint will give you some concrete questionnaires to work. So that's basically the whole preparation phase to make sure that you travel to the destination for the assessment well prepared. And then after the whole preparation, it's time for the assessment. So that's what we did actually the 2 weeks in September, traveling to Myanmar and Thailand. And during the assessment, I think it's very important that when you consult the different stakeholder groups, that you can also use different techniques. So just giving a few examples how we approach stakeholders in Thailand and in Myanmar. So as I said, the blueprint gives you some concrete guidance on different approaches and techniques when consulting different stakeholder groups. So certainly individual interviews, having kind of bilateral talks with people working in hotels, with the drivers, with a tour guide, with NGOs, with international organizations. So that's certainly one setup we use quite often. And at the same time, we conducted quite a number of so-called focus group discussions when we brought together a number of, for example, hotel workers in a hotel in Thailand, community-based tourism organizations in the northern part in Thailand, LGBT, but also women rights networks in Thailand to discuss together certain issues amongst a different specific rights holder group. And I think this tool, the focus group discussions, is very helpful. And also here the blueprint gives you some very concrete guidance on how to apply and how to conduct such focus group discussions in a specific way. In addition to that, I think what is also extremely helpful and important is to have ad hoc consultations. And we realized during traveling in the two destinations for almost 2 weeks, you somehow never stop assessing. So even when you arrive in the hotel, you might have a short chat with the guy at the reception. You might talk to the housekeeping lady, where she comes from, how many children she has, or just children going to school. When you have a transfer with a driver, you ask the driver about his working hours, whether he has a fixed contract or not. So basically, you never stop assessing. And using this kind of ad hoc consultations with a souvenir seller, the driver, the waiter in a restaurant, the housekeeping staff in a hotel, you gather quite a lot of very good and additional information. I think two things that are very important, and also here the blueprint gives you some very concrete guidance, is that you need to take enough time for the consultation. So you need to prepare yourself, take a lot of time, and also try to summarize somehow the main points after each consultation, because talking to quite a big number of people over 2 weeks, you would not necessarily remember what you have been talking to the housekeeping lady in the specific hotel on a certain day. So summarizing is very important. And also here, the online tool will provide you with templates on how to summarize basically the consultations, also focusing here on main positive impacts that have been mentioned, again, amongst the 6 working or issue areas, but also about negative aspects, gives you some guidance on also questions regarding possible solutions identified. So when you're reaching out to actually the rights holders and the stakeholders, it is important to talk about the issue areas, the positive and negative impacts, but we always try also to address already possible solutions also for the next steps. As I said, things to consider also here, the The blueprint will give you some concrete guidance about things to consider when you conducting these interviews, focus group discussions. But I would say a lot is really common sense. So use common sense when conducting these kind of interviews. As I said, you need certain skills and techniques, but there are a lot of interpersonal skills when talking to the different people. So it's about building trust. You have to be transparent on the objectives of the work you do. You have to be clear about expectation management. So what you're doing, what will change, what probably will not change. So you have to be pretty clear about expectations. Always keep it in mind that you have this kind of gender and conflict lens in certain destinations, certainly as in Myanmar, but also in Thailand. But again, conducting these interviews is not rocket science. Just bear in mind that you're talking to people, that they want to talk to you, and I think that's the most valuable when you reach out to the destinations and talk to people on the ground, is that you give them a voice and they can talk to you. So it's not an audit, it's not a certification scheme, just going through certain checklists. So it's really talking to them, giving them a voice and listening to their concerns, but also talking about the tourism development in general. And I think that's extremely valuable information you get during these consultations. And just try to listen to people, to guide a certain discussion, but at the end, it's important that they speak. I think a few challenges that we faced also during the assessment. One was certainly that when we talked to management wanted to talk to workers in hotels, for example, it was not always easy to get access to workers only. So there was always, not always, but there was quite often still a management person involved in the discussion with the workers. So there was kind of a reluctance to let workers only talk to us. During the focus group discussion, so if you have a group of 10, 12 people, you just have to make sure that it's not only one or two persons that are dominating the discussion, but you rather give everybody a voice and also the opportunity to express him and herself. In both countries, I think it was difficult somehow to address politically sensitive issues, such as land rights, corruption, government businesses. I think in general it was, and Sibyl can certainly talk a little bit more about Myanmar afterwards. In Myanmar it was quite, I think, astonishing how open people would talk compared to what we anticipated. But still, it was not always easy to address politically sensitive issues, and we also have to make sure or to bear in mind how we put this into the report. And then also the role of interpreters, facilitators. So what do they interpret? What do they translate? How do they translate? So just make sure that you keep the discussion ongoing during the focus group discussions or the interviews. But at the same time, you also want to understand what actually people are telling. So finding the right balance between simultaneous translation or kind of getting just a summary of the translator. I think this is certainly something we also saw as a challenge sometimes. Very briefly, a few impressions from Thailand. What we did actually, we kicked off in I would say quite a large kickoff, and this is certainly something you would not necessarily do in this context as a tour operator. So we had the embassy opening the event. We had 50 stakeholders, international organizations, civil society, private sector. So we had really 50 people from various stakeholder groups, also representing actually the multi-stakeholder setup of the roundtable. was a very good quality of discussion, engaged stakeholders, and people really appreciated also this exchange amongst the different stakeholder groups. We touched upon certain issue areas, but also tried to also identify already some solutions. In Thailand, in general, we had a good mix of international organizations. We met in Bangkok, for example, with ILO, with UNICEF. In Phuket, the focus was mainly on hotel management, indigenous people, and migrant workers. And then in Chiang Mai, in the northern part, we mainly looked into community-based organizations, indigenous people networks. I think what was extremely nice to see was in both countries, we had actually access to a lot of stakeholders. And I would say, apart from one or two organizations that did not want to engage, we really, there was a lot of open doors. So we got access to the private sector, to civil society organizations, to international organizations. There was a huge interest in our project. I think that was really great to see how open and willing people were to contribute to this process. And we really got a good mix of private sector, civil society organizations, but also a private sector. Few impressions from Thailand, very brief. I think one thing is that we talked about migrant workers. I think what you can see nowadays is that, and some of you might know about the scandal that came up in the fishing industry about migrant workers, forced labor. This scandal actually shaked up the Thai government quite heavily. And now more and more, actually, the laws that are existing are being enforced to protect migrant workers more and more. So in the hotels, we have seen and we have talked to people, and also the feedback we heard from civil society organizations was certainly that in the tourism sector, in the hotel sector, migrant workers nowadays are more or less, I would say, well protected, but there are certainly issues in the value chain linked to tourism, meaning the construction sector, the agriculture sector. So you still have certainly issues related to forced labor linking also the migrants. But in general, I would say working conditions through the law enforcement in Thailand are not too bad, but still there are quite a few issues linked to working conditions in the tourism sector, and we will come back to this later. One rather interesting thing we discussed also in the north with people coming from indigenous hill tribes was certainly the question on loss of cultural identity and dignity, linking to human zoos, these long neck women that are basically exposed to people taking pictures, increasing drug consumption in the villages because more and more tourists come up to the hill tribe villages for drug consumption, which has also certainly an impact on the young people in the villages. So basically they are seeing a loss of cultural and traditional rights and habitats, and then certainly this is always linked to the rights of indigenous people, certainly also in Thailand. But in general also tourism is seen as a positive industry which contributes to job opportunities, economic development, also the protection of cultural heritage. So it is not only negative in many destinations we visited, certainly Thailand. Tourism is also seen as something that is generating true income and job opportunities. So after the assessment then in Thailand, and still this is very preliminary and the draft version, we identified more or less 9 issue areas. One is the environmental impacts, mainly linked to water management. It's not necessarily water scarcity, it's water management and waste management having an impact on the livelihood of indigenous people. Then the criminalization of sex work is not having rights that would lead then also to stigmatization. Certainly the lack of economic inclusion, not only when we talk about hill tribes, we see, for example, in Phuket more and more all-inclusive hotels and concept hotels coming up, which also obviously is a discussion on how the local community can benefit. So all-inclusive becoming more and more popular, certainly in the Phuket area. Then the whole issue on women's rights and sexual harassment. Sexual harassment not only linked to sex workers, but we also had actually quite a few women telling us that they're exposed in hotels. Certainly housekeeping is very much exposed to sexual harassment, and also women working in spa areas in the hotel. So sexual harassment is certainly one issue in the Thai tourism industry. Working areas, certainly the low salary, a lot of workers, they need two jobs to survive. We have the dependency on the service charge, for example. So the whole issue of working conditions is an area we want to focus on. Child rights, not only sexual exploitation of children, but also the access to school for migrant workers, child labor in the supply chain, child begging. Those are all aspects linked to child rights. We talked about the contribution to drug consumption, the loss of cultural identity, and then also the whole question on land grabbing, land rights issues, mainly linked to indigenous people who do not have proper land titles and are therefore often very much victims of land grabbing for hotels, both in the Phuket area, but also for tourism development in the northern part. So this is basically what we have discovered in Thailand, and now the work will continue. And I would like to hand over to Sibyl, who will talk a little bit more in details about Myanmar now.
Thank you, Matthias. Hello, everyone. Also from my side, I think it's very nice to already have this webinar now. We just came back like last week from the two countries. So of course, what we are sharing is still very preliminary, but I think it's a good moment to also have these very fresh impressions that we can share. So specifically for Myanmar, we already had a question from Miriam in the chat function. Yes, there was, of course, we had to be very sensitive in the political situation, also mainly for Myanmar, where we didn't know in the beginning, to which extent will we actually be able to reach out to different stakeholders. How will the government react? We had some people we talked to before in the preparation phase who also told us we should be very careful when talking about human rights, etc. So we were very sensitive about the topic, and we had a local facilitator who actually helped us also to go and talk to the ministries in the different regions, because it is quite decentralized now in Myanmar, to make sure we can actually access those people. So once we were there, we were actually surprised how openly people talked. So we went, you can see on this current slide how we went around in different touristic hotspots in Myanmar. So we really covered the hotspots. This was agreed also with the Roundtable members that we would focus on the current touristic hotspots to do the assessment. And as also Matthias already showed for Thailand, we really tried to be as broad as possible in the kind of stakeholders we're consulting. So going from really street vendors, communities, to UN organizations, management in hotels, local incoming agents. So we covered a very broad range of stakeholders. So you can see on the top left on the picture, that's actually the assessment team. So we were Yara on the right and myself, and then there was Kaing and Tim, our two local facilitators who helped us with this assessment. So Kaing, he sort of, ones of you who are familiar with the sector-wide impact assessment that was conducted in Myanmar in 2013 by the Danish Institute and the Myanmar Center for Responsible Business. He was very much involved at that time in the assessment and helped us to access a lot of different stakeholders. And Tin, he is actually a tour guide who was with us all the time and helped us facilitating, having access, helping us accessing people in their local language, etc. And also, I think what was important for us was also his role in helping us in the sense of translating also cultural elements. Like after the focus group discussions, for example, we could ask him, why do you think a certain person didn't talk, or what do you think the person meant by what she said or what he said? So I think for us it was very important to have this cultural translation while we were on the ground. So you can see on the top right, this is actually a vocational tourism school, a very nice example of how in Myanmar, after the opening, where actually a lot of tourists came in, when the country opened up, the embargoes were lifted, Myanmar wasn't ready for tourism. There were a lot of tourists coming in, there weren't enough hotels, there weren't enough train staff, so you can actually see that now the country is really investing also in, or different projects are investing in training staff in order to work in tourism. So this is just an example of a cooking class in the vocational training center. I think one impression we had was the fact that the tourism industry is still very informal in Myanmar. In consequence, it means that the income or the potential economic inclusion is very direct. So if you buy from a souvenir seller on the street, as they are very informally organized, the chances that it will actually benefit the local people are very high. So there is not the big companies behind who will exploit those souvenir sellers, but it's actually the souvenir sellers who show a great amount of solidarity among each other as well. So we talk to them, and they are organized very locally in associations, and they actually share benefits when they sell to tourists. And so this was quite impressive to see. So there is a potential for economic inclusion, also compared to other sectors which are important in Myanmar, which is quite high in tourism. So let's say like the mines, they're in the hands of very big owners, of foreign owners, or of very rich people in the country with very limited economic inclusion. So the tourism has a high potential of benefiting people directly if it's done well. But of course, at the same time, economic exclusion is also an issue. So we have an example of the big tour buses you can see on the bottom left. They are actually called $0 tourists. So it's basically people telling us that Chinese groups who come in more and more, as China is obviously a neighbor, and so they come in and they have their own transportation companies, they have their own restaurants, they have their own souvenir shops. So people call it $0 tourism. So big groups coming into those destinations, but people having very little benefit from this tourism industry. You can see also this information on the checkpoint. So there is actually now, in the example of Bagan, you have to pay an entry fee. You pay for 3 days. Now I think it's been extended again to 5 days. Some issues there are related to the fact that this money goes directly to the central government, and the regional government is seeing very little of this money. So tourism management, visitors flow in, for example, Bagan, are managed very poorly. You can see also there's one big tower in the back. This is an example of a tower which has been built in the protected zone by a hotel. It's obviously not permitted to build towers in this protected UNESCO heritage zone. So the problem of what they call crony business, big businesses who have money, who can buy their licenses, which then build based on corruption. People have been displaced from this area, for example, where now, of course, there's a lot of local discontent about how tourism should develop in this region. So it's definitely, you can feel a lot of tension in this example of the UNESCO heritage site, where tourism planning is poor. People are already frustrated about how it developed, and those two issues, like having the crony businesses coming in, and maybe not having a lack of participation by the local people, and in parallel having this $0 tourism coming in. So people actually are worried about their jobs. And I think one point I haven't mentioned is the political situation. which leads mainly European customers not to come anymore to the country. So we had this opening, everyone wanted to come, everyone came, big masses of tourists coming into the country. Currently there is a big frustration around Europeans not coming to the country, people thinking about alternatives, people newly trained, as I mentioned before, to actually be prepared to work in tourism who now don't see don't get any jobs, don't see any alternative. Like one person, for example, who has freshly been trained by a vocational training school, told us that she has now a new business, which is her own laundry business. And then we asked her, so who are her clients? And she's telling us it's the hotels. So her alternatives are all somehow linked to the tourism industry. And if there's no tourism, she doesn't have a job. So her only alternative is actually to leave the country. And we heard quite some people considering to leave the country now. So yeah, this fluctuation in tourism numbers and people now, the risk of the brain drain, people going away because they don't see any future in this industry in the country is quite high. So I've already talked about many of the topics. So to summarize, the whole topic around economic inclusion, both positively, like the potential of like tourism managed well, the potential of actually having local people benefiting directly from tourism, but of course also economic exclusion with the $0 tourism, with the big investments by big owners who might not be as open to actually share their benefits with local population. So that it's both, it's positive and negative impacts linked to economic inclusion. Brain drain, I've mentioned. Land grabbing, always a big topic still in the country. New investments based on corrupt practices for getting licenses. People being displaced for tourism infrastructure development. Child rights, we mainly looked at also some schools that are being visited currently by European tour operators. Again, they're a big dilemma, like they seem to be very dependent on the funding that comes in through this tourism. Some people really trying to do this in a way that is respectful to the kids in the school, but then of course having these general discussions, is it at all legitimate to visit schools as a tourist? Tourism, like some people saying children should not be tourist attractions. So big dilemma also being discussed on the ground. Environmental impacts, waste management, very poor water management. So there is a lot of infrastructure development needed also for the, just in general, but also for the tourism industry. One issue related to Inle Lake, where the lake is actually the water is being polluted also by, not just by tourism, also by pesticides being used in the agriculture, etc., overfishing. Working conditions is, as I said, tourism industry in Myanmar is very informal, so you have actually hardly anyone who has working contracts. So in this sense, working conditions very poor, but at the same time, it didn't seem to be the most pressing issue for most of the people because they are just used to not having working contracts, etc. So another interesting discussion to have with tour operators also, how you want to deal with the fact that, to put it very simple, the people who have work contracts are basically working in big hotels. So the country reputation due to politics, people telling me, you should now bring back the European tourists. What can you do to bring back the European tourists? We are a safe country. A lot of discussions around the political situation. So at the end, we also had a closing workshop where the team from Thailand came back. We discussed the findings from both countries. We discussed mainly also what can now, in a tour operator's perspective, what can be done, what in their view can be done, and what kind of potential partnerships do they see. It was a very engaged discussion, very interesting to have all those people who are working on the ground.